Welcome to another episode of Pit Lane Parlay.
Welcome to another episode of Pit Lane Parlay. My name is host Mike Jokum. We are back for another Lost Tracks of INDYCAR edition with my friend Frank Santoroski here. Frank, how you doing tonight?
Very well. How are you, man?
I'm good, man. I'm ready to talk another local to me track in Langhorne Speedway. For those who don't know, I will give a quick recap before I let Frank jump in here. Langhorne opened in 1926, closed in 1927, had some stock car races, obviously open wheel, some motorcycle races, and was about 4 miles from where I grew up most of my life. So with that, Frank, where do you want to start?
Langhorne was interesting in the fact that the speedway had no straightaways. It was nearly a perfect circle. Now they had what they called turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, but it was really just a quadrant of a track, almost like if you took a pizza and made the first 2 cuts of the pizza before you made the other 2 to make 8 pieces, cut it into 4 pieces. That would be your turn 1, turn 2, 3, 4. But Langhorne developed a reputation as being very dangerous and over the years, and it kept that reputation for years and years. I believe there were 27 to 28 fatalities and numerous other injuries. Some of this was related to the track. Others were related to the safety conditions at the time. A lot of through the 50s and 60s, one of the biggest things that would injure and kill guys was burns. And that was, not necessarily a symptom of a track, but more a symptom of a fuel tank that would explode and the car would engulf into flame. And you would see that, across the board in Formula One and in some early NASCAR races and in early Champ Car races. But Langhorne operated from the late 20s up till 1941 when we went into World War II and all racetracks were closed then. But then their real heyday began after 1946. But it was a dirt track, and the turn 2 area of the track was in very, very swampy ground, and it was always kind of sinking. And it was always very wet, and there was always a lot of ruts there. And it was so rough in that part of the track, a lot of the drivers nicknamed that part of the track Puke Alley, because literally, if you weren't used to that track, drivers would become physically ill. And it was the type of track where because there were no straightaways, it was a one big left turn. You were on the gas the whole time. You had to stay committed. So again, it's just a very interesting, very different layout. But I've read some quotes from different guys. I think Bobby Usser he would say, when they all talk together, hey, who wants to go to Langhorne? No one would raise their hand. I believe Mario Andretti is quoted saying he never lost sleep before a race. The first time he went to a track, but he had a tough time before he ran at Langhorne. And of course, all those, Mario and AJ and Bobby Usser all, thrived and won at Langhorne. But a lot of guys didn't make it. A lot of guys didn't make it at a Langhorne. So.
Yeah, it's funny you mention Puke Alley. Terrible nickname. I read in my research that the Langhorne guys actually reached out to Indianapolis Motor Speedway and said, how do we fix this? And they dug 25 feet deep, put in some concrete, tried to smooth it out. And by the time, I guess it was the first race, there was all sorts of, potholes and problems again. And when they dug back down, the swampland underneath had actually pretty much just swallowed and got rid of the entire, 20-foot concrete slab, which to me is just insane to think about.
Yeah, they couldn't find the concrete after they put it in. They dug like 25, 30 feet down, and it sunk into the swamp. So you figure that maybe that wasn't the best place to build a racetrack, But at the same time, they kept going, and guys that would win at Langhorne was something you could really hang your hat on. Say, hey man, I survived this beast, ran at Langhorne, and I won at Langhorne. And Langhorne hosted sprint midget racing. They hosted early AAA racing, USAC Championship Trail, as well as the Silver Crown, and they hosted NASCAR races as well. As a matter of fact, the first official season of NASCAR, 1949, I believe, Langhorne was on the schedule. But those guys didn't find it any easier than the USAC guys did either. But again, to win at Langhorne was quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, looking at the AAA winners / USAC winners, names that pop out for those who are curious. Indy 500 winner, I believe, Rex Mays, won in Langhorne in 46. I think that was before it was paved, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they paved the track in 1965.
Yep, there we go. Eddie Sachs won in 58. To the surprise of nobody, AJ Foyt won 4 out of 5 years. In the early 60s to mid 60s, Mario Andretti, as we mentioned, Lloyd Ruby, and then the last two were Bobby Unser. So some great winners on an insane track. I'm definitely gonna have to post some pictures of this one on our show notes for everybody to see how insane this kind of looks like to me. Just looking at a picture, it's like almost a football, but more circular.
Yeah. The initial outlay there was a little flat part on the west side of the track, but largely it was a circle, and there was absolutely no banking. It was totally flat, which means you had to, you didn't have any help of banking to get you into that corner. It was all in your arm strength there. So now when they did pave the track in 65, they reconfigured it. They made it more of kind of like a D shape, almost looked like a bit of a kind of a convoluted square. The track lost a lot of character there, but then it was considered a bit safer. It was paved, so you didn't have the puke alley sinking down with all the ruts. You had a true straightaways here and there that lasted until the 70s. But one of the things that contributed to the eventual downfall of Langhorne was the fact that the track changed ownership so many times. The original owner was the original promoter was Pappy. Now I'm trying to remember his name. Pappy
Hankinson.
Pappy Hankinson, yeah, and he was there before they closed for the war, and then afterwards it was Pat Babcock bought the track. In between, there was another guy that bought the track and died right away, and so, but it was the later promoters, Irv. You see, I had all this written down. Irv Geisler and his partner were in charge of promoting the races, and they were able to draw some great crowds there. But again, in later years, and now Langhorne, we didn't mention, the geographic location is just north of Philadelphia, and like a lot of these tracks near big cities, the urban sprawl and the boom in the bigger cities in the late 60s and early 70s caused the real estate to be more lucrative to be redeveloped than to host a racetrack. So that's a common story that you can say, Riverside, Trenton, Ontario, all those tracks suffer that same fate. But at the same time, Langhorne, with the constant swapping of owners, it didn't do them any favors.
Yeah, the area where the track is in is right near one of the bigger state local public high schools. The developments that went up there with all the cookie cutter homes of the day pretty much took over the entire area. So It was a foregone conclusion that once those houses started going up in the 60s, I think it was, is when Langhorne, the town, was incorporated. That it was only a matter of time, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, that's again, if you don't, you look at profit versus loss in the track been there a long time, and it's sad. There's a lot of great tracks across the country that are just, and there's just no trace of them left. Then there's others like say North Wilkesboro where the whole track is just closed and it's sitting there because the story I read there that the cost to redevelop the property was more than it was worth, which is interesting with small town tracks. So, but back to Langhorne. The interesting thing is, and I just totally lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, Mike, but
here I'll jump in with something.
Go ahead.
So
you can tell we're unscripted.
Yeah. Obviously, these are a little bit looser than our regular episode. If you happen to be in the area, there's a Sam's Club, a Restaurant Depot, and a CarMax, and you can tell that's where the pits and the grandstands were. There's actually a little bit of a wooded area near that Sam's Club, which would have had the infield and backstretch. So as a result, there's no actual physical track itself left, minus the historical marker that you mentioned before. And I think the best nickname for the track, I don't know who coined this nickname, but the Big Left Turn. If there is ever a more appropriate track nickname, that definitely has to be it. As you mentioned, the original layout with no banking and essentially a giant circle. Definitely, it's one long left turn. I can see that making drivers pretty dizzy in the end, and obviously the bumps did not help. But one thing I wanted to ask about was you actually interviewed Mel Kenyon just the other day, and he's got a pretty interesting, not only racing background in general, but was actually somewhat of a victim of Langhorne Speedway back in the day.
Yeah, Mel had a pretty bad crash at Langhorne. It was actually the paved version of Langhorne after it was paved. It was early in Mel's career. And he, again, like we talked about the fire, the car burst into flames. And then Joe Leonard, pulled his car over, tried to pull Mel out. Two spectators in what Mel said, a couple of guys in jeans and T-shirts came in there too, tried to pull him out of the car. And the biggest stumbling block was the fact that, back then steering wheels weren't removable. This day and age, we're used to seeing a guy pop the steering wheel off. Back then, you really couldn't do that. So it was a little harder to get the guy out of the car if he was injured, and he couldn't get himself out of the car. So, but then the fire got to be too big, and the guys trying to pull him out had to back off until the safety truck got there with some water cans and were able to put the fire out. Then they were able to get him out. Now, Mel was burned over 60% of his body. He lost all the fingers on his left hand and his thumb. If you ever meet Mel, he's just got that little nub of a hand there. And yet he was back in a race car in a couple of months after they said he was going to be out for a while. Now he contributes his Christian beliefs a lot to his recovery, but at the same time, I just think there's something in the psyche of a race car driver that these guys are like super athletes. I mean, how many times have we seen a guy that they give him a timetable for recovery, and then he's back in a car before before projected to? And we've seen this with Bourdais, we've seen this with Hinchcliffe, and of course with Mel Kenyon. But it was pretty devastating. He could have burned to death right there. He could have stopped racing forever, but instead, having that racer spirit where I just want to race. His brother helped him design a special glove with a grommet and a little hook to hook on the steering wheel, so he can sort of grip that steering wheel with his left hand and primarily use his right hand for the steering motion. So again, horrible crash there for Mel, but then again, this guy kept driving into his 70s, and ended up, winning nearly 400 midget feature races, 7 championships, and he's in like 4 different Hall of Fames now. So it was awesome talking to Mel last night. It's like you don't often talk to a guy of that caliber, and when you talk about how the early race car drivers were true tough guys, and that's something you hear like Robin Miller say a lot. Oh, the tough guys of racing. Yeah, Mel Kenyon is the true tough guy of racing.
Yeah, he actually finished 3rd in the Indy 500. I think one of his 7 or 8 attempts.
Yes, yeah. He ran 8 times at Indy. He finished in the top 5 4 times, and had a 3rd place, I believe, on his 2nd attempt. Yeah. So, and the funny thing about Mel is because I in anticipation of the interview, I watched a lot of old film, and I noticed that he drives the sprint midget car a whole lot differently than he drove the Indy car. And so he was aggressive as all get out in the midget car. He would knock you out of the way to get to the lead. At the Indy 500, this dude was smooth and consistent and perfect, and didn't drive beyond the limit of the car, and that worked well for him too. But you just see how smart of a guy he was, knowing that you can throw that midget around a little bit, but when you get to a place like Indianapolis, with a car with a lot more horsepower and a lot more cars on the track, you need to respect that. And he has some great finishes.
So I'm going to completely change gears here because I was rereading my notes and I completely skipped a line. The gentleman who owned the track for about a year, probably not even, Earl.
Yeah, the stunt
Lucky Teeter. Yeah,
stuntman. Yeah.
Yeah, he crashed his rocket car leap stunt actually at the Indiana State Fairgrounds. So tying back to Indiana there, but wow, I don't know what a rocket car leap stunt is, but it sounds pretty insane.
It sounds like Evel Knievel's, Snake Canyon jump many years before his time. Yeah. So, but yeah, that guy picked up the ownership of the track after the war, and a year later he was gone, which created the void. That's where the Babcock family came on in, and then they brought in Irvin them to promote. So, but yeah, that's an odd little story too. If you think about the types of things you would see at a state fair, somebody doing a jump in a rocket car.
Yeah, I that one caught me off guard. I'm glad I actually went back to find it, but I'll wrap it up with a couple kind of little interesting facts here. It was actually a 100-lap race for the first, 5 to 10 years on Labor Day. So it was almost like a little local holiday event here in the Pennsylvania area, which is kind of neat. Obviously, by the time I was born, there was nothing left. Let me see what else I can find here. Obviously, I ran NASCAR. The motorcycles actually ran in the 30s to the 50s. So the motorcycles ran there when it was completely unpaved, which to me is just mind-boggling. I don't know too much about the motorcycle racing world, especially back then, but I imagine it was pretty just as dangerous as a champ car.
Oh, certainly. And I've watched some flat track motorcycle racing, which is current, goes on today. There's a horse track up here in Lexington, Kentucky, where I live, that hosts a flat track motorcycles, and that's just insane. But I can imagine it at a place like Langhorne, where it's so muddy and ruddy, and there was several motorcyclers lost their lives at Langhorne as well. So it's equally as dangerous for them, if not more so, because you don't fall off of your INDYCAR, but you sure can get thrown off of a motorcycle.
Yeah, that's it's a very good way of putting it. So listen, Frank, we will wrap up our Langhorne edition here. We'll probably title this episode "The Big Left Turn." Seating capacity was 60,000 at our little local Langhorne Speedway. Also went by the name of New Philadelphia Speedway and Philadelphia Speedway, despite being, roughly about 45 minutes outside the city. So any last words about Langhorne Speedway?
Well, I mean, the other nickname that we didn't mention they call it the track that ate the heroes. which
Well, I like that. Even though it's
yeah.
kind of morbid, I like that.
Yeah, it's kind of more. But even if you think about, the fact that it ate the concrete and this and that, like it's a big monster. So, but yeah, it's big and bad and scary. But the guys that conquered it, I mean, always have that to hang their hat on. So.
Cool. Well, again, Frank, thank you very much for joining me for another one of these. We will definitely, in a couple weeks, look at a track maybe outside of the Pennsylvania area here, and we'll go something West Coast. But thanks very much for joining, everybody listening. Hope you enjoyed another Lost Tracks of INDYCAR episode, and we will be back again in the near future.